Well, hey, everybody. Matthew Janecek. I'm here with a great friend of mine, Mr. Bob Blecher. And we were just going to shoot the breeze.
Yeah.
What was your jump-off point for your own personal awakening? You know,
Oh, my own?
because
Well,
I have like a specific incident that happened to me.
Oh,
so,
really?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I can't think of one thing. I'll be honest with you. But maybe you could share yours, and
All
one
right.
will come to me.
Well, you know, I think when I had my grandfather's World War II stuff, my mom had a frame when they crossed the equator. Some ceremony in the Coast Guard or Navy, and he was officially Coast Guard. He was on a troop transport around the world, and you know they'd take you, hold you down when you cross the equator, and involuntarily shave your head, amongst other things, right? So, but I looked at those plaques that he had during his service in the war, and one was Roosevelt, the other one was Truman, and then the Secretary of the Navy at the time was James Forrestal. And on both of them, he signed those. And then one day I was watching something, and James Forrestal's death I was made aware of, and how he died. And so the first Secretary of the Navy became the first Secretary of Defense after the National Security Act of 47 is passed.
Okay.
And then 2 years later, he's involuntarily committed to Bethesda, jumps out a window, and kills himself. That's the official story.
Okay.
But I knew that's hogwash. So
Right.
that began my rabbit hole dive.
Right.
So, and I think
How
after
long
that,
ago was that?
I mean, I think I always had, a lot of big suspicions about power and history and being a lot different than we maybe understand it.
Right.
But I think that was the first confirmation. It was probably 10 years ago.
Oh, okay, okay.
You know?
Yeah. Well, if I had to sort of say, sort of like when I reached like a threshold where I would like actively seek out the truth and just not take whatever version was being peddled in, say, newspapers or textbooks or even really any books, I guess, is there was a point in my life, and I want to say it was maybe my late 20s, and at that time I had been a lawyer for about, I don't know, maybe over 5 years or so. And I just wondered, I had hit the pinnacle of what the society defines as success. You know, I mean, I was successful. I mean, I had my own law practice. I had employees. I was busier than busy could be. I had a wife. I had a house. I had kids, and I was miserable.
Yeah.
And you know, and I think that is like, what is going on here? I've done everything that I'm quote supposed to do, and yet everything just seems false. I don't know how to say it.
No, I like it. Yeah.
And I don't think that's an unusual experience. Maybe my response to it might not have been entirely conventional. You know, I switched careers and things like that. And a lot of people don't do that, but I do think that realization was showing a motivation for me to move beyond what is false and to actually explore what is true. And I think that, so that's a process that's been going on now for 30, 40 years, and it still continues.
Yeah, that's the thing. My process is ongoing. I don't think it's ever going to be over.
Yeah. No, I don't.
There's
I
some-
hope it isn't over.
No.
I mean, I think the energy is in the process. Yeah.
I think that's, the teaching. Ironically, we shared the same classroom.
Yeah, I
You
know.
know.
It's crazy.
So
Yeah, excuse
I
me.
think that's pretty amazing. But, yeah, the process of spiritual growth we've talked a lot about before. But how do we get there via today and what's happening? You know, we just spoke a little bit before, but I would like to hear it. Like how do you process everything that's happening in today's paradigm, since this paradigm seems to be wearing down?
Well, I think the paradigm is dysfunctional to the extent that it is disconnected from what is true. And I think that, on a personal level, it looked like me being unhappy, depressed, miserable, while I am, shall we say, successful in quotes. But I think on a collective level, it's just when the way that society is organized becomes completely disconnected from truth. I think that's what collective misery looks like. And I think that's what we see today. But for me, I would have to say that the process that I'm still going through, it started really with the process of, shall we say, me investigating the truth for myself in a very secular way. It wasn't a spiritual thing at first. It was more like, well, the government is saying this, but what's really going on? And it's that kind of thing. That's where it starts. Or the economy's organized like this, but, what's sort of the reality beyond the surface of what's happening? And I think that's, and that makes sense because those are things within our experience. But
I did a similar, that's
right.
my similar journey, I think, to that was an intellectual approach. And I've said before that I'm very, was concerned early on that my only search I could tap was the intellectual, and I was concerned about the emotional side, not the spiritual side, not being able to tap it, And I had read, I'm like, what am I missing? But ultimately it came, and I'm still thankful for that,
Yeah, I think that one of the things that our society disconnects us from is the fact that we are spiritual beings. I mean, spirituality and religion are really, shall we say, intentionally marginalized and excluded within our society. We have in America, it's called the separation of church and state. But it really is the shall we say, the idea that's just inculcated in all of us that anything that's spiritual or religious is automatically something which is irrelevant.
It's
the way
marginalized.
that we live our lives.
Or it's a sign of weakness. I think.
It's hard to get in touch with that, and it took me a long time too.
So to marginalize, and I think I was brought up that if you were spiritual in any way, that you were dependent then on something, on something where you're not being yourself, and you should be. You're not
independent.
You're not independent enough.
You're not in control of your life.
Right.
I get that.
I think that's how faith or religion has been presented to a lot of young people, as it's a form of control, not a form of liberation.
Oh, very much so. I totally agree. Right.
So I think that, that seems to be one of the big areas that I would say hopefully we can see change, but that's got to be on the individual level.
Well, I mean, for me, I have to say that there was a point where I understood, shall we say, what the government was really doing, or how the economy is really organized, or how the political system really works, or how our social systems actually operate. I began to understand that, but I found that being caught in that and understanding that didn't honestly make my life any better.
I think actually maybe the more that we become aware, it becomes a little more difficult.
Depressed we became.
Yes. Becomes a little more difficult to function in those.
So my sense is that, at least for me, that was something which I think was a necessary process for me to go through. But I find that, and I have a lot of people I know, and really many close friends who sort of that's sort of where they are. And so when I talk with them, is all they want to talk about is how screwed up the world is. And then we can all be depressed together. So I found that to be very inadequate. It was like, okay, I'm very good at what we call critical thinking. Meaning I'm criticizing everything, and it's a very negative. It's a way not to live your life as opposed to a way to live your life. It's a way not to organize society as opposed to a way to reorganize society. And so I think that looking for truth, is that the only truth? And I find that a higher truth and a much more positive and constructive and creative truths. They lie at the spiritual level.
Yeah, and we talked about that new sort of teaching opportunity to actually explore the truth and big questions without restriction. And that's going to be an exciting thing that I'm going to get to try. I look forward to that. And I see a lot of young people are craving something. You know, they're they're desperate for something. And greater truth. The one thing, the misery-loving company, like you say, with your friends, you can identify that. But what are the solutions? Are the institutions going to be providing any of these solutions, or is this going to be from the people?
Oh, well, I think that it's not an either or thing. I think that it's the kind of thing that each individual has some responsibility for, but I also think it's the kind of thing where we're all responsible to each other. And I think those things go on at the same time. It's like, it's not about me, sort of, shall we say, getting to a point in my own intellectual and spiritual development that I'm so developed that now I can go out in the community. Is I think that at whatever stage I'm in, whatever that stage is I need to also at the same time be involved in relationship and in building relationships and community with others, because a lot of my learning comes from other people. There's only so much I can do on my own. So I feel like that active part of doing what I can to be of service with whatever capacities I have right now is a really important part of my own individual development as well. So those two things go together.
It's an ongoing process, this education for the individual. And what do you think the biggest roadblocks really are to
education?
Well, education, or this awareness, this growing awareness that maybe that people are searching for that spiritual element, or what's getting in the way of that educational pursuit of truth that may help kindle that spiritual element. And I mean, I think we both, or a lot of people, would love to see that element get activated in human beings so we can relate to one another in a better way, guided by the spiritual principles that are reflected in every faith. So, yeah, what gets in the way of that?
Well, I think this is just me talking, and I should say that these are not just my thoughts in a vacuum,
right.
But from my study and reflection on different spiritual writings, but especially the writings of the Baha'i faith, is my understanding is that the first thing that people need to do in order to in order to be, shall we say, protagonists in society, people who are active agents of constructive change in society.
Hey, honey.
Hey.
How are you?
Awesome. What are you guys up to?
We're hanging out and talking.
We are.
That's cool.
How was school?
Awesome. I got the mail.
Thank you, honey.
It says something about me about security thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, hon.
You're welcome.
We are.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, so I don't know. My sense is that the first thing that anyone needs to do in order to move beyond, shall we say, the negative, the reactive, the disempowering, the paralyzing, is they have to come to grips with who they are, meaning their own identity. I think that's really the starting point. And when I say identity, I think that on the one hand, obviously, on the one hand, we are material beings. I mean, there's a material element to us, but we're also people we also have a soul. And so we also have a spiritual element in us. And my sense is is identity has been reduced in our society to something that's entirely material. So I'm defined by the color of my skin, or I'm defined by my religion, or I'm defined by my culture or ethnicity, or my nationality, or I'm defined by my gender,
ideology.
or my sexual preference, or my ideology, my political ideology. And so in the absence of being in touch with what is that spiritual part of our identity, we tend to emphasize all the material elements. And as a result, we have this very, shall we say, lower or incomplete understanding of ourselves. And then it also creates a tremendous amount of conflict with other people. And this is obviously something that disempowers all of society. So I think the first step is to get in touch, actively in touch with who we are most fundamentally as a spiritual being.
Yes, I see that, agree with it, but how does one that may be genuinely interested in this pursuit go about it today in a way that's actually going to be, I guess, effective and beneficial, where they're not going to run into these institutional obstacles? I mean, the institutions right now, the roadblocks that a lot of people are running into is they know that the truth narrative, as it's consumed in mass media and culture, is not accurate. There's a growing awareness of that. Lying is becoming more of the norm from institutions, and leaders, and that the people have usually looked to. So there's a consciousness that's awakening there. But I guess it's then going to be what to do with that energy,
Well, I don't think that, I know I did not find any of this, by watching TV news or by reading books written by academics.
Yes.
I don't know anybody. I mean, I'd be curious to know if there are anybody who really has. For me, is that although human beings have some capacity to discern what is true from what is false, and some people are better than it than others, is that capacity in humanity is imperfect. No matter, and that's just how it is. That's why we're always in the process. I feel, my sense is that the highest levels of truth are always found in something which is perfect truth. And the only perfect truth that's available to us is through revelation. That's the highest truth that is available to us. So,
but it'll still be incomplete, though, right? Because you can't know it.
Well, I think that for me, at least, is reading and reflecting on different holy writings, whether it's Baha'i writings or whether it's Islamic writings or Buddhist writings or whatever, Christian writings, whatever it would be, is writings which are revelation or summaries of revelation actually have the possibility to elevate our level of understanding truth beyond what we have the capacity to do ourselves. It's still not perfect knowledge, because I don't have the perfect capacity for knowledge.
Right.
But it's what allows me to continue to grow. And what I find is really empowering about that is that these are positive statements of truth that we could apply not just in our own lives, but we can also apply them to the way society is organized. And so for me, I'm extremely optimistic and hopeful that as more people become more, shall we say, dissatisfied with the status quo, and as more of these people become open and receptive to understanding truth at a spiritual level, is not only will more people actually be cultivating their spiritual capacities and lead happier lives, shall we say, but more and more of these people are now able to build communities, and that, starting at a community level, that actually are functional, constructive, and consistent with the highest truths that we're capable of understanding. So I'm honestly, I know the world looks dark, but I want to say, as I think there are, shall we say, seeds or glimmers of this incredible light that is gradually becoming more and more available. It's almost like the darker the world gets, the easier it becomes to see the light.
Well, yeah, I think I've said for a few years to classes, we've lived through in American history the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, and I've predicted there's going to be this Third Great Awakening.
I think it's here.
It's here. It's happening.
Right.
But yeah, what to do with that for many, I think, people that are in charge, I guess, of organizing this paradigm. That's reached a point where they're disconnected from the spirit so much,
Right.
that the lie or lies become the norm, and the awareness that the mass of people are having to that, whether it's a political front, an economic front, whatever it is, or the hiccups we're going to go through as a transition, right? Obviously make people more aware, alert, nervous, because it's so uncertain. What's the... So...
Yeah, I don't think that on an individual level, I think this is really open to anybody at any time. But on a societal level, I think this will take a tremendous... it will take a tremendous amount of time. And I think it's just something that we have to understand, that this is not the kind of thing where you pass a law and now everything is okay, or a new president is elected and now the world is set right. It's that idea. I don't see that if that's our expectation, is we're going to be very much disappointed.
Well, massive change in all of world history has generally come in the wake of something not good. In
Definitely.
the wake of war,
Definitely.
in the wake of economic ruin.
Right.
When we study the Great Depression, it's the causes of it need to be comprehended as much as the effects, because it's cyclical. That happens again and again. It happens to empires. It happens to nations. Don't know if they all may fall for a different reason, a little bit, but there's a lot of general themes that coincide with that.
I think that I see change. It's like a lot of people. I mean, I taught history like you did, so we have a general idea of sort of like what does that look like. But I know that one of the things I taught, I think it's one of the things that's really accepted today, is Karl Marx's theory of change, which is like a material dialectic of change, where you have essentially two opposing forces that will ultimately be engaged in a violent conflict. And through that violent conflict, there is progress. And this is honestly how Karl Marx tried to make sense out of the French Revolution. And this has become, even you don't have to call yourself a Marxist to understand that this is the paradigm that we're taught. Is you have two forces, call them good and evil, perhaps, and there's going to be this huge face-off between them. So it applies on every level.
Yep.
And I think my sense is that although there are sort of like different points of view and there can be opposing forces, my sense is that within history is there really is only one process of change. And shall we say, so the opposing forces are part of not, shall we say, a battle between two things. It really is one process of change. The first step is that there is, shall we say, a disintegration of the present order that's happening. And I think that's what we're seeing now, as our institutions become more and more removed from the interest of the people they're supposed to be serving, and more
Destructive.
destructive and removed from the truth as we see the disintegration of society. And on the other end, we see people who, shall we say, are moving, shall we say, toward integration. There are pulling together instead of pushing apart. And to me, they're part of the same process. They're both happening at the same time. In fact, the more disintegrated a society becomes, is the more people become, shall we say, remove themselves from it and become open to, shall we say, different ways of thinking and living. That maybe they, without the disintegration, they never would have been open to before. And they become part of an integrated process.
Yeah, it's from personal, to make this so tangible, the idea that the most of us, when we buy into this system, literally and figuratively, we are automatically in debt for our whole lives.
Right.
So
Right.
whether that debt is by a home or college or
Right.
lifestyle choices, whatever it may be.
Right.
And you're scrambling your whole life trying to remove yourself from that hole.
Right.
By joining the club, you've created a hole for yourself to have to get out of.
Right. Right.
So
I agree.
yeah, so that seems to be the biggest thing that will keep people from achieving even a spiritual pursuit of truth, because they're running ragged trying to get their economic life in order because
Right.
it's set up as a losing game to start.
Oh, I agree. I think that people are just overwhelmed and exhausted.
Yes.
Chronically overwhelmed and exhausted.
Yeah.
But I do think there's a point in time where people have to stop, like I did when I was a lawyer. You have to stop and say, what am I doing? And I honestly believe that the process has been accelerated by this COVID
Oh yeah,
pandemic.
yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating for me to see that there's tons of jobs and people are not applying for them. They've sort of removing themselves to whatever extent they can from the system. Or people who went back to work are resigning, saying, wow, this is not worth it.
Yeah.
And so it's fascinating to know that there are people who, shall we say, took stock of what's important.
Yeah.
And have begun to reorganize their lives and begin to make space for their own development, for seeing things in a new way, for being part of other communities, for not just committing their lives to to maximize their material wealth.
That absurdity of reality. You and I have shared teaching in different veins, and I told you about teaching with the Chinese
Right.
kids in the
Yeah,
outfit.
it's so cool.
It's just the irony of in our system, which we want to teach free thinking in theory. At least that's what we say. We want want that. It's more of a challenge to do that in our system today than it is where these folks have found me via the internet. And I am teaching, high-end Chinese communist kids, even though their parents, I don't know what ideology they believe, but whatever they believe, have steered their kids into classes where open discussion and free thinking is in demand.
I think so. I
Yeah.
think that I think that everybody wants it. It's just not that excuse me, it's just not that everybody, shall we say, feels confident that they have the capacity to do it. I mean, I don't know a person who doesn't want to see the world become a better place. And I don't know a person who doesn't want to reorganize their life.
Well, you and I
In a
have talked. We
way.
talked about that though before. Like, how do we deal with the existence of evil? And you haven't thought about that. That's
Yeah.
good. But we know that there's evil deeds, at least, that are happening in our current
People
paradigm.
do bad things,
Yes,
yes.
and the worst things you can think of.
Oh, yes.
As this may be part of our greater cultural awakening.
Oh, yes. I think so.
The wake might get crazy. So how do we unpack that?
Well, I think it makes it more incumbent on us to take responsibility for our own intellectual and spiritual growth, because a lot of people, what they're struggling with is they're struggling with being able to cope. I mean, people just are at the point where they can't cope with how bad things have gotten, or they can't cope with how bad their work has gotten. They can't cope with other people.
Well, you're getting the people have to cope now because we're having mandates put
Well,
on there.
but-
People they have
Right.
to make like
Right.
crisis life moment decisions now.
Right.
And institutions are forcing people to have to make these crazy decisions
Right.
that they never thought they were going to have to make.
Right. So, but I think that the worse things get in that way, the more urgent it becomes for people to take charge, shall we say, of their own education. I mean, I've had to cultivate my intellectual and spiritual capacities to know truth and to live within truth. I've had to take that upon myself. But because I am willing to do that, I'm better able to cope with the suffering that just seems to be increasing in the world. I also have to develop my own skills to be in a constructive relationship with other people. Because, something is like, we'd like to think that we're self-sufficient and we could do all this alone. But that's never how it's been. No. And I just know that I need to be in community with people.
I'm become more aware of that myself. I think that's the awareness of humility growing in people, which is spiritualism. We need one another, but to become aware that it's going to be an interrelationship, or we're going to have inner reliability amongst people of like minds. But the scary part is there's a lot of people that don't even think about that, because they're too removed in the entertainment world of knowing more fantasy football characters than historical figures. I mean, they're just so detached from maybe reality and escaped. Yeah, maybe that's a better word. Yeah, right. That they don't know where to go now. And how do guys like us, or maybe you can explain, how do you discern better information toward the truth than maybe not as good information toward the truth? Because we talked earlier today about deep fakes. This is a reality. Like, you can project people's faces out there and create an entire person in the cyber world, and then present that character as the actual person. Right. That person could be Trump. It could be Jesse Smollett. It could be anybody. You can project whatever reality you're trying to create in this digital media world and present it off as truth to a consuming public that is hungry for truth, but they're being lied to, or that this is all it is confusion and chaos. Right. And how do people process that?
Well, I on a personal level, I mean, I approach it in two ways. On an individual level, I think I have a responsibility to myself and to others to cultivate my own capacity to, shall we say, know what is true, and to cultivate my own capacity to be in active conversation with others. But then on an individual level, I think I also have to be the kind of person who then is constantly reaching out and making myself available to others, so that they can hear something other than or in addition to whatever else they're going to receive through more establishment media sources.
Right.
But on an institutional level, I mean, I'm as a member, for instance, of the Baha'i Faith, and I don't know if that's it's certainly not the only organization that's doing constructive work, but it's certainly one of them. Is I think I'm also involved in the process of creating frameworks that could build institutions for beginning a community that are also functional. So I take that on as a personal responsibility. It doesn't mean I have all the answers. God knows I don't. Yeah. But with whatever abilities I have, I feel that I have a responsibility to myself and to others, both on an individual level and within the institutions of the faith, to actually constantly be reaching out to other people. And my sense is that, and this is not my statement, just one of my own mentors mentioned this to me, and I know we talked about this, but I asked him, how do you describe the work we're doing? And he said, we're changing the world one heart at a time. And I feel like it's easy enough to remember, and sometimes I have to remember that.
It's going to be a long
but that's okay.
That's okay.
But think about it for a second. How many people how many people in the world you actually do come in contact with. There are countless number of people. And if you see every single person as an opportunity, an opportunity to be sharing with them this kind of gift, because I see it as a gift, is that within a relatively short period of time, if this is what people begin to do, is you're going to have really constructive change from the bottom up. And that's the only really constructive change is always from the bottom up.
Right.
I mean, I can't tell you how many countless numbers of people that I've come in contact with, and in some way, shape, or form, that I've opened themselves to the possibility of having these kinds of conversations.
And one of those avenues, you spoke of the Baha'i faith too, and I love investigating and reading and finding out more. As a Christ follower, as more of a Christian, I see that as one of the paradigms that people have to understand, but also learn to address that there's a difference. I think the ideal Christian Jesus follower is a lot different than the institution that manifested his message, and projected their version of that message on the world. And it's an enormous historical divide. But I think people throughout history, at least what I've seen, is they have a trouble maybe in the modern demarcating between the two ideas. That even the Christ that I'm aware of and that have been taught and learning even more and more is open to all those things that you had just discussed. The ideal.
Right.
And fostering those conversations.
You mean Christ as opposed to the church.
Correct.
Right.
And as a spiritual framework is Christ, the individual and what he symbolized is the framework of the goal, maybe like Baha'i. But the institutions of it are the things that have manipulated the message and or been complicit in some sort of evil act and deeds over the history of
Oh, yes.
So in horrible ways. And I think those two things younger people are having a hard time separating, that there can be a difference between spirit.
I did too for much of my life.
I think so too. I think that's an obstacle.
But I would say that the point where I am with it is I would have to say that for me is I worship God. I don't worship a manifestation of God. I don't worship the Buddha. I don't worship Moses. These are just visible expressions of God, or messengers of God, or prophets of God. You know what I'm saying? Is I don't worship Muhammad. I worship God, and there's only one God. And I think that if this becomes the starting point, then religion can be something that pulls people together as opposed to tears people apart. My sense is the institutions of any religion have essentially deviated from God the moment that the religion itself has sexed, meaning it has divisions within the religion.
Right.
Because the moment you have divisions religion is, I feel like the ultimate purpose of God is unity. Like, for example, personal salvation is the unity of your soul with God. That's the highest state of your spiritual existence. But to me, in this world, the highest state of existence in this material world would be the unification of all mankind. You see, so any time a religion splits apart into different sects, it's automatically deviated from the message of God himself.
Because they're claiming that we've discovered the truth. Oh, it's this.
Right.
So anytime somebody claims to have discovered the truth, and then we need to implement this certain truth, you've lost your ability to be humble, and the act of being spiritual is total humility.
Yes.
You need to surrender that authority. Wisdom comes through humility only, and it's like you said, I perceive that as a gift, and a gift that's been granted that level of discernment, but I don't know how I want to help project that in any way. And the culture of tolerance and the culture of openness and the culture of the types of conversations that has thrown us into this idea. You know?
Yeah. I think it's really important. It's hard to make progress in, when there's divisions. The divisions in the world are really as what is destructive, it's stopping the ability for us to pull together and therefore make progress. So unity is important on any level for there to be any kind of progress. But I think it's especially important at the spiritual level, because the moment that we all see the religions of the world as somehow being at odds with each other is the moment that is the moment that stops spiritual progress in the world. I mean, it's unfortunate that it's gotten to this point. And my sense is that most people I know, and certainly this is the way I was trained academically as well, is their vantage point toward religion is about how are the religions different from each other. And they want to know, like, how is Islam different from Christianity, or how is Judaism different from Zoroastrianism, or whatever.
Yeah.
And this is the emphasis, is always to take
Divide.
a critical look at this, and this itself is very divisive. If instead people ask themselves, what are the larger unities that exist within each, but shall we say, between the religious traditions, and if they understood what is the proper way to see the relationship, let's say, between Jesus and Moses, or between Muhammad and the Buddha, what is the relationships that exist between them? How do we make sense that these different prophets of God would be chosen by God over time and deliver messages to humanity over time? How do we understand, shall we say, the logic of God? I think, honestly, to me, that's important. And me being a history teacher, I want to make sense of the relationships between the different manifestations of God. Because my sense is that, Muhammad is bringing the true religion of God and everybody else is false, is only something that's going to continue to separate people from each other and obviously cause a tremendous amount over history violence.
Oh, yeah.
We have to move beyond that and ask a different question as to what is the relationship between Muhammad and Christ, or what is the relationship between Muhammad and the manifestation in the Baha'i faith, which is Baha'u'llah. How do they actually, are they part of one larger process?
Well, let's use something this is something I personally have an issue trying to comprehend and deal with in both a spiritual but also a academic way of understanding the Bible. As a history teacher, I know that the Bible is compiled at the Council of Nicaea, and the Romans put it together, and they edited and selected what should go in there. Like, as a cerebral person, I know they did that. But then as a spiritual person, I also know that I believe that everything happens for a reason too. So I got to try to reconcile that with myself to say, how do spiritual texts reflect the
words of God?
Yes, yes. And to what extent have they been altered by mankind? They have, but is that also part of the divine plan too?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't know if I have a complete answer to that. I mean, I've thought about that. My sense is that if it is a book that contains revelation, there will be spots in it that are truly the words of God that will be passed on, and I think that certainly applies in the Gospels. But at the same time, there's going to be spots which, shall we say, may not be as authentic, right? And they're more human. But I think even those human aspects of a holy book, they're, shall we say, divinely inspired. And they are above the level of humanity. On a personal level, I tend to, just as a history teacher, when I'm reading a Buddhist text, I want to know what the Buddha said.
Oh yeah, primary source. Yes.
Right, and I will consider, shall we say, what other teachers of Buddhism how they've interpreted this over time. But I'll tend to, I would say, give a fundamental credence
No, I think
to the
that's-
Buddha. And the same when I read the Gospels, I'm looking for what Christ has to say. And I think that's the case. I do think that Revelations, holy books, have become more accurate as Revelations become more recent. And it's honestly one of the reasons I consider the Baha'i Revelation to be extremely the most accurate ever. It's the idea that not only was the prophet of God in that time, was he himself literate, like Muhammad himself was illiterate. And I don't think Christ wrote anything down. I could be wrong, but I'm not sure I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. But Baha'u'llah was literate. He was born, he was given an education as a noble in Persia. And not only that, is when he did a revelation, when something was revealed by him, it was recited, and then in his presence, he kept a secretary with him all the time. And it was done, and then it would be authenticated by Baha'u'llah. And if it was authenticated by him, it actually would bear his seal.
Yeah.
So there's very little question that that revelation is authentic. There's nothing but the Word of God. And I think that's only possible because Baha'u'llah was a prophet who lived during the 19th century.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So I think that, and certainly Baha'u'llah will not be the last prophet of God. God is limitless, and he can choose another to speak for him to humanity at any point in time, conceivably. But my sense is a lot of that is just the trouble with a historical source, right? But I don't think it takes away from the spiritual value of holy writing.
So, and that tolerance of imperfection maybe is a roadblock for a lot of people toward that spiritual growth. They're looking for something that's perfect.
Yeah,
It's
maybe.
gotta be. If it's God, it's got to be this.
I mean, I think you've hit on something that's really a huge question for people today.
Yeah.
And that's how does one know what is true, and how does one discern what is true from what is false? And honestly, if after all my years of searching for truth, because we talked about this process, is I go back to actually something that was revealed by Baha'u'llah, because he said, "Here's the starting point," and he said, "O son of spirit, my first counsel is this: possess a pure, kindly, and radiant heart, that thine may be a sovereignty, ancient, imperishable, and everlasting." And I think that's so powerful, because what he's saying is that whatever we know certainly, meaning without doubt, is something that we know in our heart. And I know all of us, we're born with this capacity to know, coming out of the womb, that my mother loves me. And that's not something you need to read a book about. It's not something you need evidence for.
Right.
It's something you know and you're certain about, and you know it in your heart.
Yeah.
And I think that this is a really powerful statement. If people literally could, and I'm not saying don't consider the scientific evidence or don't consider the claims or the arguments. Don't consider all of that. I'm just saying is put that in its proper place. I find that any intellectual knowledge, meaning knowledge which essentially is processed through the mind, is always subject to doubt. And anything that's subject to doubt is automatically paralyzing. The only knowledge that is certain knowledge, and therefore a basis upon you to act, and to act with certainty and to sustain that action despite obstacles, is going to be something you know in your heart. And the only way you could receive that knowledge is to possess a pure heart, and to possess a kind heart, and to possess a radiant heart. And that actually is a tremendous power. That's a tremendous power, and I think so much of this is lost. It's socially conditioned out of us.
It is, yeah.
But it can be regained because no matter how much it's socially conditioned out of us, it's still there.
It's still divine.
It's still there. So when I finally got to that point in my life where I understood this, I found it was still there for me.
Yeah, and I thought I never knew how to tap into it, and then I thought it was absent, and then
Right.
I was able to do it at some point.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. I mean, I even remember reading a number of quotes from Albert Einstein, and although I haven't memorized them like I've memorized that one Baha'u'llah quote.
That's a great quote.
Is they were all along the lines of science is really about trusting your intuition, and to me that's, shall we say, an intellectual of saying what Baha'u'llah had to say. Trust your intuition. Your intuition actually will guide you in ways your mind is incapable of.
Yeah, that's having appropriate balance. I think for many young people, science or faith is an either-or scenario, and I think in the way that they've conditioned us to believe that that is the case is one of the obstacles to spiritual growth, is they're not separate from one another. So it's been put to me this way in Bible study: there isn't any question at all that God is afraid of you asking him.
I like that.
You know? So bring every doubt that you've ever had to this discussion.
Yes.
And challenge me with anything, right?
Right.
And you will be in that happier place, just having that relationship or that awareness. Maybe, and oftentimes I would do at the beginning of school years, saying that little voice inside you that your conscience, we'll call it, does your conscience ever lie to you? Does it tell you that it's okay to cheat on this thing, or it's okay to lie, or it's okay to take whatever your major tenets of every global faith is, and say, does your conscience ever tell you that you should do this wrong thing, or is it just whether you're choosing to execute? Or it's been my experience that it doesn't tell you something wrong. It's giving you a truth, and it's whether you decide to put that truth into practice. And to me, that's been the proving. If people want tangible proof, that's the closest I may be able to get to the existence of God. If people want some sort of proof, that seems to also be a roadblock for people, because
well, if you want scientific proof,
Yeah.
You've defeated the whole search
Yes,
as
yes,
well.
yeah.
Because a spiritual truth is beyond physical. But a science can only study the physical world.
Yeah.
So the moment you've the moment you define the question of the existence of God in material terms is you're completely lost.
And this is maybe, and you felt this earlier in your life than I did, but as you become, I think, just more aware of some of these things we've been talking about, and you're a teacher of the actual history stuff that's put in textbooks, right? And you become growingly, I would say, a little bit aware that some of those things aren't entirely accurate. As a matter of fact, it's the exact opposite.
Yeah.
So how do people reconcile that with this change that we're all living through, this paradigm change, where I found it harder and harder to operate as an educator of history the more that I knew, because the more that I knew, I was realizing what I was teaching was often not true.
Right. Well, I mean, I made a personal decision that I would only teach what is true. And I just made that decision, but I also feel that I survived through the educational system, and certainly I had to make a lot of compromises. We all work within limits. It's just how life is. But is in many cases I developed the capacity to allow my students to investigate the truth for themselves. So it isn't necessarily a truth that I would have to say. It was a truth that would naturally and organically come up in discussion based upon materials I would have provided, based upon discussion questions that I would have raised that are open-ended.
Yeah.
And once they're raised, now we can actually have a discussion about what is true and why, for example, a textbook, for example, might be misleading us. And those are like those moments that are reasons to remain in the classroom.
Yeah.
Shall we say? But I can't say that always worked, because sometimes it's hard to find materials that work. And I can't say I could do it all the time,
Right.
because there are constraints in terms of what we have to cover. But I say I've constantly, more and more intentionally looked for opportunities within the curriculum that would provide those, shall we say, those moments that have the potential to provide for those moments. And it's hard. I will say that having been out of the system for a few years, is I have no desire to go back into that system. I'm still incredibly interested and fascinated by anything educational. And I think the process of learning is one of the most mysterious and fascinating and engaging things for me to study. But I'm convinced that any real education has to come from outside of the present system and has to be about the building of frameworks for the creation of a system that actually is consistent with truth, including spiritual truth, not just intellectual truth.
Right. And maybe the best way to do that is on that community level.
Yeah, that's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Well, this has been fun, Bob.
Yeah, really. This is wonderful. It's always fun to talk with you.
Yep. Oh, I love it too.
Because, you are motivated by the question. That's a beautiful thing.
Oh, thank you. Well, we'll keep doing it, and we'll keep doing this.
Okay.
All right. Let's see.
I don't know how long we did that for.
I don't know. Let's stop it and see what happens.